My name is Father Mark Bosco, Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University. Welcome to Dahlgren Chapel of the Sacred Heart. This chapel is our physical embodiment of the deep faith and spiritual sustenance at our nation's oldest Catholic university. In this sacred space, generations of students, faculty, staff, and alumni have encountered God in the sacraments, in prayer, and in communal reflection. In the spirit of our Jesuit and Catholic heritage, we profess here our deep respect and sincere appreciation for people of all backgrounds who seek to grow in faith as well as in knowledge. Georgetown's Jesuit tradition of education has always prized both the pursuit of truth and virtue. It is the transformation of the whole person, from ignorance to understanding, from isolation to dialogue, from indifference to moral responsibility, that characterizes the best of what a Jesuit education like Georgetown is all about. So much of the discourse in our nation and in our world has hardened into a rancorous noise. It has distracted us from our ability to have informed, honest, even prophetic dialogue about the ethical issues facing us today. With the Dahlgren Dialogues, we hope that a conversation in the midst of this sacred space might offer a more prayerful posture to engage political, academic, and spiritual leaders. Framing these dialogues within a place of prayer and worship can sustain and empower us to be more active participants and renew our common sense of purpose. Tonight, the Office of Mission and Ministry, in collaboration with the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought, continues our series that seeks to deepen these conversations around social justice in light of the rich and deep theological heritage of our Christian faith. Tonight, we share our thoughts, reflections, and prayers on solidarity with the Church and the Jesuits in Nicaragua, responding to repression and denial of religious freedom. We begin and end the Dahlgren Dialogues with prayer. I would now like to invite Georgetown students Adriana de la Calle Vizcasillas and Nicolas Marinacci to come forward and lead us in prayer. Please stand.
Loving and merciful God, in this beautiful chapel, we come together as a community, bound by your shared commitment to be women and men for others.
We offer gratitude for our ability to celebrate your bountiful love for us. Moreover, we're grateful for the privilege of gathering and bringing people together to stand in solidarity with those who are less fortunate. Your Holy Spirit fills the world with your presence and fills our heart with grace and love.
Lord, we are troubled by so much anxiety about the meaning of our human existence, by the polarization and conflicts around us, by the death and destruction of war in the Holy Land and in Ukraine, and especially the repression in Nicaragua, which diverges from the Jesuit values embodied by our university. For this we pray.
Señor, concédenos la gracia de imaginar y crear un futuro lleno de esperanza, justicia y paz, especialmente en los corazones del pueblo de Nicaragua.
Te pedimos que cures nuestro mundo roto y alimentes en nosotros una fe que haga justicia.
Bendice nuestro diálogo de esta tarde. Bendice a nuestros oradores, bendice nuestro trabajo para mayor gloria a Dios.
Amén.
Welcome to all of you here. My name is Kim Daniels. I am the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown University. It's so important that we begin our time here together with prayer, of course, tonight. Our hearts are broken by war in the Holy Land, war in Ukraine, the repression that we see in Nicaragua, of course, so many other places around the world where people suffer from violence and war and repression. Tonight, we'll focus on how the Catholic Church in Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan people are suffering. Catholic leaders have been forced into exile. Bishop Rolando Alvarez has been imprisoned. Religious women have been expelled. Charities closed. Seminaries dissolved. Thousands of Nicaraguans have been forced into exile, threatened and attacked for their opposition to the current government. while many more suffer from gripping poverty. The Jesuits have stood with the people of Nicaragua in countless ways, offering education, fighting injustice, working for democracy, respecting human rights, and seeking peace. Yet this past August, the government suppressed the Society of Jesus, expelled the Jesuits from the Universidad de Centro America, the UCA, and seized properties and assets belonging to the Jesuits and several other Catholic religious orders. These actions and others threaten basic rights, rights such as religious freedom, freedom of expression, as well as economic and political stability in Nicaragua and the region more broadly. As we honor Jesuit Heritage Month here at Georgetown, it's especially important that as a Catholic and a Jesuit university, we be sure to express our solidarity with the students and the faculty and the staff of the UCA and with our fellow Catholics and all of those suffering in Nicaragua at this distressing time. So tonight we'll discuss the challenges presented by this situation in Nicaragua, the attacks on the church, the attacks on the Society of Jesus, and how the principles of Catholic social teaching can help us stand in solidarity and advance justice, peace, and religious freedom. We've assembled a wonderful group here tonight to help us with this conversation. Father Matt Carnes is a Jesuit priest and an associate professor of government here in the Department of Government and in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also an expert on the region in Latin America. Rena Guidos is a reporter at Global Sisters Report, where she covers Nicaragua and other national and international issues. She worked at Catholic News Service for many years and is the author of Rutilio Grande, A Table for All, about the Salvadoran Jesuit who inspired St. Oscar Romero. Renato Yontop Colosi is a Georgetown University student from Peru, studying international and political economy, Italian, and international business diplomacy. He's an active member of the Georgetown campus ministry community, serving as one of the student coordinators of Hispanic Ministry, and he's close to many in the Nicaraguan community here on campus. You'll see our chair over here. Representative Jim McGovern was taking a late vote tonight, which went well, I understand, and he is on his way over. So he will be a little bit late with us tonight, but he is on his way, and we're looking forward to him joining us in a little bit. I want to just mention now, since I don't know that I'll have time to do it then, that he represents Massachusetts' 2nd Congressional District. He serves on the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. He has a long history of leadership in Congress on human rights. It goes back to his time as a congressional staffer when he led an investigation into the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter in El Salvador. And I want to note that the anniversary of those assassinations is this coming Thursday, November 16th. So when we get to the Q&A period here in Dahlgren Chapel, we'll be taking questions from the audience right here with us, and especially we love to have students ask questions. We'll prioritize your views here. We'd love to hear from you. And for those joining us on the live stream, please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #SolidarityNicaraguaGU and by tagging GUCST Public Life and Georgetown OCM on Twitter. So with that, let's get started. And I'd like to start by asking each one of you for just an opening comment to get the conversation rolling. Rena, let's start with you. As we begin our conversation here tonight, what do you want those joining us here to keep front and center as we talk about what's happening in Nicaragua and what Catholics and others are facing right now?
I think one thing that strikes me with being in a chapel like this with the Jesuits is that they always tell you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody, and I think put yourself, about all we're going to say, in the shoes of what's happening in Nicaragua, or people who can't stay in a chapel like this, who woke up one morning and the university was suddenly closed, who were worshiping one day and the pro-government force came and interrupted their service. And sometimes, we're fed by a sister or a religious brother, and the next day those services were gone and they were left on the street. So please think about, all that we're going to discuss under the eyes of those who have felt this.
Thank you. How about you, Father Matt? What do you think we should keep front and center as we begin our conversation?
I was thinking back to that day in August when the Jesuit University was seized, and my first thought was, wow, this is us. I mean, this is what we try to do in a Jesuit university here at Georgetown. We try to do research and teach. We try to seek understanding of the world. We try to speak up for justice, and how how really vulnerable that is. And the story of Nicaragua is one that is very specific to what's happening right now under the Ortega Murillo regime, but it's also one that is broader than that. And it's one that actually, as we think about the creeping authoritarianism in so many places, that is chipping away at our ability to sometimes seek truth and sometimes promote justice, that's something that implicates all of us. And so I think we need to keep front and center how this is being lived out in Nicaragua today, especially in a way that has that creeping sense of a little bit more, and I'll say more about this as we talk, but it's getting ticked away. Freedoms are getting ticked away on a daily basis. But we're very connected with that as well, and we need to really confront it both there and at home in the ways it can affect us around the globe.
I'm glad you highlighted that. And also, something that I've been struck by is sort of our membership here at Georgetown in the larger Jesuit community, and how so many schools are coming together, the AGCU and other organizations coming together to stand together with those in Nicaragua. Renato, how about you? What do you think about this? What do you think we should keep front and center as we begin our conversation, particularly from your perspective as a student?
For me, it's more like there are people whose voices have been silenced. There are also people who are afraid of speaking, but we also have people that even when they have the chance of speaking, they feel afraid because of, any type of repression from, like, in this case, their own government. So I do believe that in this case, like being us in the panel, we are having that opportunity to represent the community, to lift up the voices for those who cannot. And also that education is a very powerful tool. And it's because of that tool that it actually opens the minds of many people, that allows them to think, to be creative, to see other things from other perspectives. That also it hurts to see when, education is closed, or in this case, removed as a basic human right because someone just didn't like the way people think.
Sometimes we're in class, we don't realize it's a basic human right. We don't appreciate how much. I'm glad you highlighted that. I also want to just say thank Renato for being here, because we do have a very robust Nicaraguan community, obviously here in DC, here at Georgetown as well. And other Nicaraguan students, we thought about having a Nicaraguan student with us here on the panel. And they were advised by their family members and others in Nicaragua that that would be unwise. And so Renato is here, has spoken with so many in that community, and is here to represent them. And we're so grateful for you doing that. So thank you very much. Rena, let's come back to you and get into our conversation a little bit more now. Rena's just a wonderful reporter who has covered the Catholic Church in this region in particular in depth for many, many years. I'm always struck by your coverage about how you focus on religious communities in particular, and the people on the ground, and what's happening, how we're serving our gospel mission. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, fill us all in here in the audience about what's been happening since 2019, what's happening now regarding the treatment of Catholics and Jesuits and others in Nicaragua.
Sadly, it's a very easy question to answer, because what hasn't happened to the Catholic Church in Nicaragua? A bishop has been imprisoned, a bishop has gone into exile, priests, students have been beaten. People, like a lot of young people in here, from one day to the next went to jail or were killed. The Vatican embassy was shuttered, relations have stopped. It's been so many things. Sisters from one day to the next were again feeding the poor or teaching in schools, from one moment to the next had to leave with whatever they could hold, including some who were elderly, who were in wheelchairs. Suddenly were told to get out. And it's a very difficult thing for us to imagine, but if you can, again, think of how would we react if Cardinal Wilton all of a sudden had to be gone the next day, or if he were imprisoned, or if he were beaten. Those are things that are happening, that are real. There's some people also in this audience who found themselves in that same situation, who, in Nicaragua, and I'm not going to point out who, but, who were one day having their say, and all of a sudden the space closed, they were in prison, and then they ended up here in this space with us today. And that's something that none of us would want to go through.
How do you think these developments, you've been covering the region for a long time, how do you think these developments affect the church, affect the Nicaraguan people? What's been the response of the Vatican, the US, other countries to what's going on?
I think that understandably so. A lot of it has come, in comments, or statements. But I've also seen some very, wonderful developments with what happened with the Jesuits when their properties were seized in August, when the residence was taken away, when the university was shuttered. Other Jesuit communities stepped up and started giving scholarships to the students from those universities in other countries. Some took in some of the Jesuits who could no longer be there. And a lot of them have, worked. There's a Jesuit priest in El Salvador who is now the spokesperson for the community in Nicaragua. So you see that, the church, as much as it can, has stepped up. I think that it's a very difficult thing to do because they're trying to keep some spaces open for discussions that the government, for obvious reasons, doesn't want to be open. And I mean, this is the whole reason why, they have, shuttered some of these spaces, schools, universities, gathering places that the church would keep open because they don't want these discussions to take place.
Thanks, Rena. Father Matt, let's turn to you now. You're a Jesuit priest. Of course, Georgetown is a Jesuit university. Tell us a little bit about the Jesuits' history in the region, and also what your reaction was to the closure of the UCA, the actions against the Jesuits, how that felt to you as a member of this community, and what they mean in light of the educational and social mission of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you. I had the privilege of working with Central American Jesuits for a year after a hurricane in Central America that's affected mainly Honduras and El Salvador. So I worked very closely with members of the Central American province of the Jesuits. And what struck me by their work was that it was frontline work with communities as they tried to build better futures. And that took every form. So it was every form from running parishes as people tried to better their lives, education at grade levels, at lower grade levels, higher grade levels, and university level, and in particular running a network of very important universities. So the UCA is part of three. They're all Universidades Centroamericanas, although they don't all use the UCA name. So UCA Managua, UCA El Salvador in San Salvador, and then the Rafael Landívar in Guatemala would be the third of that network of three Jesuit universities that are all connected together. And each of those universities has chosen to focus on engaging their society at crucial moments, hearing the cries of those who are suffering, being a voice for them in some cases, educating those who would like to move forward in their careers, and really being that space for dialogue that Rena described. Now, to think concretely about the UCA Managua, if you flash back the last few years in Nicaragua, as the Ortega Murillo regime started to tighten the screws, and that's really something I want to describe today, this slow burn of tightening the screws. If you go back to 2018, they particularly started cracking down on students, student protesters in the street, who are calling actually for better social policies to serve the population, many of which were for the aged. It wasn't even for the young, but they were calling out for better social policies. The government didn't like this, so it actually chased them and hunted them down, imprisoned some of them, but many of them fled to the UCA in Managua and then were inside the gates, and that was a safe haven for them. The place was surrounded by the military for a while. The Jesuits chose to harbor those students and to stand up and say these students have speech rights. Slow burn. So then that's allowed to go on for a while. Now, the Jesuits are prominent enough, and the Catholic Church is prominent enough, that the regime didn't immediately shut down the university. It shut down other universities that didn't have as big a name, one after another after another. It jailed students. Every time it could get back at the UCA, it did. So when its rector, a Jesuit rector, traveled outside the country, he wasn't allowed to come back in. When their vice rector traveled outside the country, not allowed to come back in. Anytime they could make sure that they kept people away that they didn't want to hear, they did that over and over again. And then finally, only the culmination of this was shutting down the university. And by the way, in case you're wondering, it's now reopened, rebranded with the name of one of the revolutionary heroes, a crony of Ortega. And it offers a number of degrees, none of which would ever teach you how to challenge the regime. So it is back there, and they're trying to basically keep and, in a sense, remove the legacy of the Jesuits there. But the Jesuits, and this is the last thing I want to mention, in spite of the fact that the university was shut down, in spite of the fact that the Jesuits' legal entity that allowed it to work in the university was shut down. They didn't shut down everything. And so the Jesuits continue to run 3 important high schools. Many of the Jesuits that were working in the UCA are now living there. And they actually run a network of 50 different Fe Alegria schools. These are education at the most basic, lower level, dealing with often children in poor communities. And the Jesuits have continued to operate that with a whole lot of courageous lay people who are running that. And so that Jesuit idea of accompanying people, even in the hardest moments, that's something that is sustained even to this day and goes on.
It's such a profound witness, right? And it really tells us, signals to us how important education really is to the life of a country, the life of a community. You're also a scholar of the region, of course. I'd love to ask you a little bit about what you think about the relationship between religious institutions and the social and public political life of a nation, right? How is the repression of Nicaragua's church institutions here, religious institutions, also civil society, how does that interplay with political life here and in the region more broadly?
You know, religious institutions tend to be those spaces in civil society where people can gather and can speak to one another. In fact, under a number of authoritarian regimes, if we think back to Poland, if you remember the Solidarity movement, how important the church was to nurturing a space where people could talk about an alternative future. So often in Latin America, that's been the case as well. If you think to Chile and the example of the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, that was able to collect data on human rights abuses and ultimately be a ground where people could start to organize to demand change. That's something religious organizations do better than others. And I think it's because of a deep sense of transcendence, a deep sense of a divine purpose at work, a sense that these values are so important to me that I can't imagine surrendering them to a regime that's somehow threatening this. So that's been a really critical space that's been preserved by religious institutions. But I am particularly worried because Rina mentioned the spokesperson for the Jesuits in Central America, Chema Tojera. So Chema Tojera was the Jesuit rector of, the provincial of the Jesuits in Central America back in 1989 at the time of the murder of the Jesuits in the UCA in El Salvador. He was the one that had to come and see the bodies when they had just been murdered there outside the university. He now has continued, of course, to live his life as a Jesuit, working in multiple countries in Central America, and now is the spokesperson for the Jesuits to address what's just happened in Nicaragua. And he had a reflection the other day that has stayed with me where he said, looking at the situation now, I see it as more dire than what I experienced in El Salvador when our Jesuits were killed there. And he said, and people asked why, and he said, because now the spaces have been so closed that no one feels free to speak out. There is no space to do that. That's what the Jesuits were trying to preserve in UCA. It's one of the reasons why it would be so foolhardy to ask any Nicaraguan student or any Nicaraguan exile to speak at an event like this, because they know the regime is watching their families and can go after their families. And that level of repression is something that Tojera said he had not seen before. And it really chills him about the future for real, honest dialogue that can then lead to change.
It's fascinating. It's just so distressing. And I'm just also again struck by how what you say, that religious institutions can preserve this space in a particular way because of, in some way, as you say, the view of the transcendent, right? And the sense that it's so important. Thank you very much. Renato, let's turn to you. As I mentioned earlier, Georgetown's blessed to have so many students from Latin America. And as we mentioned, you're here in many ways speaking for your friends, your students, fellow students in the Nicaraguan community here at Georgetown. How have you seen this affect them? How have they seen it affect your fellow students? And what does it mean for those here at Georgetown who have family in Nicaragua who might go back after their time at Georgetown?
Thank you for the question, Professor Daniels. First of all, as you mentioned earlier, I'm not from Nicaragua myself, but I was born and raised in Peru. I was able, during my time in high school, to actually be exposed through a similar case with people that immigrated, especially from Venezuela. And that gave me a perspective to actually understand more about, issues that are politically related and how they affect families and in particular students. And then when I decided to come to Georgetown, one of the reasons was to have that exposure to see the world, not just from a regional perspective, but more a global one. And here at Georgetown, actually, by talking with my peers, my friends from Nicaragua too, I've been able to realize that like the future that they have, even like with the education they receive here too, it's difficult for them to actually envision themselves back, because like every single change or like project that they would like to entail or like to create, it will be difficult to have it if there's still a government that actually won't be happy by, you know, understanding or actually taking into consideration the many different things that they would like to bring into the table. So that's something hard to accomplish and to see because of the suppression that actually exists through the Ortega Murillo regime. And then on the other side too, this feeling of, you know, some sort of like being far from home, but at the same time being very well connected. How can I help my community through my time in the United States? Like, how can I give it back? And like, you know, there is this feeling of empathy too. Like we as like, you know, students that are not actually from Nicaragua or like who have not been able to be exposed to this reality, we need to also put ourselves in like on the shoes or like on the other side of the table and try to see how this reality actually affects other communities and people. And at Georgetown, actually through the classes, through, you know, the community that we actually even have through the Hispanic ministry, we're able to also like talk about those different realities and understand more how to, you know, we can grow even better as students and, you know, and not just only as Catholics, but like as members of Georgetown.
What do you say to people here and to your fellow students in particular? What can people do? What does it look like to stand in solidarity, both individually and as a community here? You know, we are a community here in this room. We're a community at Georgetown and the broader community in Washington and beyond. What can people do to stand in solidarity from your perspective?
So one thing that I will say people can do is like, of course, you see that you have peers and friends that like are not able to publicly speak about this because of, you know, government retaliation or like some sort of like pushback. But if you are able to actually inform others about like the different realities that are happening, like you don't have to, you know, be an advocate of like a big change, but at least if you are informed and you inform others about like what's going on, that's a very good way of like furthering and spreading out like the message of like a very like sad and deep reality that is happening right now in Nicaragua. And like it's also repercuted not just in one single space, but we see those models, especially of authoritarian regimes that try to suppress people's voices in many different examples. And one of them in this case with the Ortega Murillo regime has been by suppressing the Catholic Church. And then another thing that I will recommend my peers too is to actually engage in these conversations with your fellow students. You know, sometimes we're afraid of actually speaking or like trying to entail in conversations with them because it's like, you know, could be a hard or like not a very good topic to entail conversations with. But we are very, you know, engaged in the matter. Like we want to share the realities of our countries. And in this case, in the case of Nicaragua, like my peers are like they're open in like what's going on in their country. They understand that situation and they're not afraid of sharing their perspective on the issue with other students.
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, that's what it means to be part of a community, right? Is to recognize when other people are suffering and to reach out and to stand with them and to listen, to start with listening and educate yourself. Thanks so much, Renato. That's wonderful. Rena, I'd like to turn back to you. You wrote a remarkable story about women religious in Nicaragua. You mentioned earlier elderly people living in wheelchairs, and I remember that from your story. Can you tell us a little bit more about the situation of women religious there? I just know, you know, certainly in history in Central America, Latin America more broadly is so powerful. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
I've actually been surprised because, you know, everywhere I've gone, it's been very hard to get people to speak on the record, even if you, you know, even if you promise anonymity, they will not speak to you. One of the reasons I ended up going in March to Costa Rica was to talk to a lot of the people who have fled Nicaragua to go to Costa Rica, and nobody wanted to talk to me, except one of the sisters who was from Nicaragua, who had been expelled from one day to the next. And, you know, she was now working in feeding the poor on the outskirts of San Jose. And I all I said was, hello, sister. And, I told her who I was, and I didn't even ask a question, and she just came out and started telling me how difficult and hurtful this whole situation had been. Not at all talking about herself in the community, but about how she had seen the faces of the people that, they had left behind. It was the Missionaries of Charity that I'm sure you've heard about. And that was the first group that we all know of that, it was 18 of those women who were kicked out, and the government, has accused a lot of these groups of, some sort of malfeasance, accused them of any number of things. And, then they have used that as an excuse to take their properties away. That's exactly what happened to them. But she said, it's not so much these properties that we left, it's the people that we left behind that hurts the most. Because in some cases they were able to find other people who would take care of them, other orders, and in other cases they weren't. And so remembering those people who were just left, on the street and with nothing, no one to help them, she just, sisters are very resilient. They're very full of hope. They're pretty tough, some of them. And this was I've never seen brokenness like that in a sister. And that was a very, very hard thing to listen to. Recently, I spoke to another sister who's in Nicaragua, and she expressed how a lot of people would come to talk to her. She said she's a nurse, but now she only practices the ministry of listening, as she called it. She cannot say yes or no when people come to talk to her, because she doesn't know whether that person is there to turn her in for one reason or another. She doesn't know how to comfort somebody. And one thing that one of them said was that she feels, exactly this, the space is closing in. And this was a few months ago. So I wonder every day sometimes, have all the spaces closed in? Because that's what she can't talk to other members of her community. When I was also in that trip to San Jose, I talked to another sister who, and this is a reality of what's happening in the church and in Nicaraguan society, who told me there's nothing wrong in Nicaragua. Everything is fine. My order has never had any problems. I know that some people have had problems, but it's because, they have said this or that. But basically, she was a bit angry with me that I had asked the question. So that's one thing that I did ask the other sister about, and she said that's precisely why you can't have a conversation even within your own community, within your own religious community, because you don't know who's there, you don't know who's going to say, what about you? It's something that's so foreign to us, where we can, even though there's a lot of polarization in this country, we can sit and fight out loud and nobody will turn us in, to anybody, and we won't get taken away. That's not what happens to them. So you can imagine that for these groups of, women who are used to listening and who are used to encouraging, that's what they do, that's who they are. And that is not an option to practice what they signed up for.
What an evocative portrayal of what the degradation of democracy looks like, right? It looks like the spaces closing in. It looks like the poor and the vulnerable suffering the most. It looks like fear. And thanks for that. Matt, I'd love to turn to you for a little bit more of a historical perspective, I would guess, given your understanding of the region. I'd like to ask, just in particular the Jesuits in the region, some Catholics in the past obviously opposed U.S. actions in the region, I think particularly in the 80s, especially support for the Contras, and at that time some defended Ortega and the Sandinistas, and now we see how Ortega and his government has come to be an increasing threat to democracy and human rights. I'd love for you to tell us that story a little bit, and maybe the broader historical region story.
No, it strikes me that this is the complexity of our histories, isn't it? and especially the way the history of the Cold War played out in the region. So, that was the dying embers of the Cold War. So the sort of the embrace of the Contras and the U.S. fear of the Sandinistas. Others felt support for the revolution that the Sandinistas were seeming to be unleashing during that period, especially one that spoke of things like liberation. And there were plenty of people in the Catholic Church that were very supportive of that and joined the regime and felt like this was the promise of a change, of a new beginning, especially overturning some of the deep-seated inequalities inside the country. And that's something actually throughout the region. Latin America historically is the most unequal region on the planet. Division between rich and poor is the greatest, not the poorest region, but actually in some ways it's more glaring because that division between rich and poor is so glaring and so persistent and so unchanging. And so when Ortega comes to power that first time, there were a number that were very enamored of that. Others were opposed for a host of reasons, especially reasons around religious liberty. But you saw a number really following through on this. And to me, it raises the question of who do we, in a sense, give our allegiance to? Who do we ultimately think we can deliver on the things that we hope for? And I think too easily we sometimes give ourselves over to simplistic solutions. Sometimes because they serve a vision we have of the world, sometimes because they serve us personally, sometimes because they serve what we think is the religious vision in a place, how quickly we can be sort of caught up in that. Now, the Ortega that comes back is a very different Ortega than the Ortega that governed initially. But one who is, especially in this return over the last 15 years, really dedicated to taking care of himself and sustaining himself in government. And that's been clear, but he's been almost masterful, if you will, if you read sort of a dictator's handbook, at just increasing or closing the spaces just enough that most people, most days, aren't willing to stand up to it. Okay, that's the trick, right? Most people, most days don't want to stand up to it because there's still enough space for me to preserve my private property. There's still enough space for me to preserve the things that I want to be doing. Now, when you take to the streets and start demanding something, as the students did, that's when you see the active repression. That's when they step in. When they start to realize the universities are too much of a threat, that's when they start to step in. So over and over again, you see them closing this space really because they recognize that it's a threat, but they've been masterful about not all at once taking over everything. And as you say, there are plenty of people that will say, it's not affecting my life too much today, I guess I can tolerate it. How often do we sometimes say that in our own lives? It's not affecting my life today. It might be affecting that other group's life, but it's not affecting mine today. Now, what's interesting, though, is when you close spaces internally, I just want to point out that sometimes that opens up spaces externally. And when I think about the solidarity of the Jesuits recently, that's been really remarkable, the sisters too, and we could look at lots of different examples of this. But what happened when the university was shut down? Well, the other Jesuit universities started to organize to receive all of those students so that they could complete their degrees. And this is actually trickier than you think, because when they seized the university, when the government seized the university, they seized all the records. So students don't even have transcripts. It's hard to know exactly what they've done, but the other universities said, we'll work with you. And students have gone to those other schools I mentioned in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and many of them are completing their degrees there. In fact, there's been an effort among the universities in the United States, in the AJCU, to raise funds and help support students so that they can finish out their degrees. Because you think about how dislocating that is. You're almost done with your degree, and now you're told you'll never get it. So to do this kind of solidarity is opening up a space that's bigger. But then the other thing that the Jesuits have done in Latin America that's really remarkable is they've now created a network of all the Jesuit universities throughout Latin America to create an observatory for democracy, to study democracy as it's lived in each of their countries. And we're very fortunate today, and I as a political scientist often make use of various studies and indices that can come up with sort of numeric representations of how strong is democracy or how weak is democracy in these countries. But they tend to, in a sense, put lots of evidence together and kind of simplify it when they come up with these indices. Understanding the lived experience of how democracy is going on a daily basis, that's something that very few people can compile. But the Jesuits, by having people in every single country in Latin America with these universities, can actually document what does democracy look like, its strengths, its challenges, its weaknesses, And Nicaragua is not the only country that's facing challenges in its democracy in the region, but it is one that stands out. And because we're doing these studies, we can then take that to a larger world and speak about that. The first study was produced by this group of Jesuit universities and promoted globally, and it's something that's been studied in all sorts of circles. So this is something where Jesuits are saying, we have people on the ground who are experiencing this, and we can help tell that story. In some ways, in this systematic way that complements the way that Rena does with her journalism, too, in terms of getting the story out. Because I think if you were to ask people in Nicaragua today, what are they most concerned about? Maybe in part that this slow burn that's going on starts to get ignored by the rest of the world, that we all lose, our attention span gives way, and we don't pay attention to the need for change there. So I think Jesuits, by raising this up, are in some ways helping all of us keep our eyes trained on the region.
Thanks so much for that. I had a chance to be at the UCA in El Salvador last year through a wonderful AJCU program, and I'm just struck by how democracy and challenges to democracy are front and center everywhere. So I appreciate you highlighting that. And Renato, I'm going to come back to you and ask you what that might feel like for you to have all of a sudden all your hard work at Georgetown go away like this, and how you might respond, how your fellow students will respond. But first, let me say hello. Thank you so much, Representative McGovern, for being here tonight after taking...
We kept the government open.
Yes.
All right.
I think we're just so happy and thankful for you to be with here. Really appreciate it. And I'd love to, we've introduced you, told everybody about your work, your past work in the region, your current work now. And I'd love to just start by asking you, if you don't mind, you've been a champion of human rights, of justice, of peace for decades. You worked as a staffer for Congressman Joe Moakley when 6 Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter were assassinated. We've already mentioned the anniversary coming up on November 16th. And I
had many forums in this chapel and in other places in Georgetown.
There's a great history here, right? I'd love for you to talk about your evaluation of the situation, of what's going on in light of that experience that you bring.
Well, it's painful because it is very reminiscent of events that happened in El Salvador back in 1989. And, and it's hard to know what to do, in part because, quite frankly, the United States and a lot of the world kind of taken its eye off the ball in Nicaragua. We would focus on other things. And I don't know why. That's not an excuse, but it's just a reality. And I think, when the crackdown on dissent, the crackdown on political opposition, the crackdown on free thinkers, and in turn the Jesuits, has been going on for quite some time. I mean, and yet the warning signs built and built and built. And I don't think that the international community, I don't think the United States was focused enough on what happened. The Ortegas, for years have been going in the wrong direction in terms of respecting human rights. They kind of lost their credibility. I remember when they first came to power, there was great hope. After Somoza and all the terrible things that were going on, there was just great hope that maybe things were going to change. And much of what they said back then was in line with kind of liberation theology, that we were going to empower the poor. And they've kind of turned out to be like crooks, corrupt, into themselves. And so I think the question for us is like, what do you do now? And a bunch of us did a letter to the president, basically saying, okay, let's think of concrete things we can do. One, the young people who are getting an education there ought to be able to continue to get a Jesuit education somewhere else. Let's find ways to support them to do that, whether it's at the UCA in El Salvador or someplace else. But it's really a very troubling situation, a heartbreaking situation, because the people in Nicaragua, quite frankly, are suffering terribly right now.
We've talked about, I'm glad you mentioned the letter that you and others wrote. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what the United States, the global community can do, those of us here can do in order to respond to the repression, the loss of religious freedom, the attacks on democracy. What can we do? What should the U.S. do in other countries and us here as well?
So one thing is we have to call out the human rights abuses. We have to pay more attention. We have to elevate our concern. As I said at the beginning, I have a great frustration that the United States, for many years now, has kind of taken its eye off of Central America and Latin America in general. We're focused in on other parts of the world. And yet so much of the turmoil and so much of the difficulty that prompts so many people to come to this country is happening south of our border. So one is we need to call out human rights abuses where they occur. We need, because that in and of itself may not be enough to change things, but we want them to know that people are watching. So that's number one. Number two, we need to think of concrete things we can do to help people, right? I mean, are there things that we can do, like, for example, help students that were at the UCA in Nicaragua get an education, a Jesuit education someplace else? What are the concrete things that we can do, to help individuals who are, dealing with some great, great hardships right now? The one thing I don't think we should do, and we're very good at this, is we just have these blanket, sanctions that we put into place that we think somehow is the right response. But it turns out that the people that get hurt the most by some of these blanket sanctions are the people we're trying to help. Ortega and his wife will always find ways to live like lifestyles of the rich and famous. I mean, they will always be okay, but I worry about the impact on regular people. And so I think given what's happened, this is a time for the United States to kind of re-engage and to refocus. And by the way, not just because we care about what's happening in Nicaragua, but what's happening in Nicaragua, is contagious, right? Look what's happening in Guatemala. I mean, we have a government in Guatemala now that doesn't think that it has to cede power to the newly elected president. Look what's happening in El Salvador. We have this president who is running again for a second term, even though it's against what the Constitution says. He's kind of like Donald Trump with a Spanish accent. But the point of the matter is that we've ignored the realities in places like Nicaragua for so long and it's some of the worst aspects of what's happening there have been spreading to other countries.
I wonder if I might ask one more question, and then I'll come to you, Renato. And then we're going to go to questions from you all here in the audience, so we'll be ready for that. We've been talking about the role of the church and civil society institutions and how important that is in these kinds of situations where democracy is being degraded. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the role of the Jesuits, of the church, of Catholic social teaching is in the region, in these kinds of situations, from your perspective in political life and public life?
Well, I mean, I credit the Jesuits with kind of bringing me back to the Catholic faith, because quite frankly, it was getting kind of boring for me. I wasn't feeling it, right? And then I met the Jesuits in El Salvador, and all of a sudden, I started to get excited about my faith again. This whole notion of liberation theology, the whole notion of a total dedication to the poor and to help lifting people up and to be a voice for the voiceless and stand with people who are being persecuted. I thought that what an important mission that is. I want to be identified with that. I want to be part of that. And I think that's why a lot of people want to get a Jesuit education or want to be associated with the Jesuits. Now, having said all of that, it's a very radical and controversial message for people who do not want change. And in El Salvador, the Jesuits were murdered because of their advocacy for the poor. They were murdered precisely because of that. And I think in Nicaragua, the persecution of the Jesuits is the same thing. I mean, it is inconvenient for Ortega to have to respond to that. And it is dangerous to his status and to his power that we're going to empower the poor. We're going to give them a voice. And so I think that the role of the church is really important, especially in Latin America. And I think we need to be wind at the church's back. And I say that not necessarily, out of kind of a religious motivation, but just in terms of this is about people's rights. This is about giving people dignity. This is about giving people hope. When I grew up, You know, the priest always used to say, blessed are the poor. Like, it's like good to be poor, right? No, I mean, the bottom line is everybody deserves rights. Everybody deserves food. Everybody deserves shelter. Nobody's kids should starve. Nobody should be persecuted because of what they believe and what they stand for. And I think that message of empowerment is very threatening to people who are in power. So I think this is a time for all of us to, again, reinforce the message of the church, and to be, and again, working with the Jesuits on the ground, because sometimes, you know, we don't want to do things that make their lives more complicated, but listening to them and figure out how can we be wind at their backs? How can we help, not only provide them protection, but give them the space, help provide them the space where they can continue to advocate for the things that they have been advocating for.
Thanks so much for that. I mean, so powerful to say we should be wind at the backs of this radical, powerful gospel message, and I really appreciate it. Renato, I love your reaction to what you've heard here tonight, and especially this idea that, you know, imagine that Georgetown was closed, that you were all this work. You know, what do you think about what that might feel like? What do you think about what you've heard about people standing together at their Jesuit universities, standing together? Tell us more about what you've heard tonight.
That's an excellent question, because I mean, universities are not only a place for, you know, intellectual capacity, but it's also like a place where you foster community, where you are even allowed to, you know, start developing that creativity, that open mind that even like crosses horizons. And in particular, a Jesuit education, it's an education focused on, you know, mind, body, and soul. So in particular, if Georgetown, you know, let's say closes, it'll be, first of all, be hard to, you know, like grasp that reality. Like, imagine like you were so close even to finish, you know, like your time at the university, and like you're not even allowed to graduate because like some sort of like impediment happened. And so what this brings me into consideration is like, think about, you know, the community that even can be far from home too, like especially as Father Carnes was mentioning to, you know, the other Jesuit institutions that are in the region, in Guatemala, in El Salvador too, like that they're even like trying to accept these students, you know, to bring them, you know, closer, like to finish their studies. But even though like there's some sort of, you know, contingency from even like the government itself from like allowing the release of their transcripts and like any sort of other information. So one thing that it's that's been working at least, and I know it's like there is this Todos Somos UCA, the We're All UCA, which is like the Nicaragua Emergency Fund that is run by like the Jesuit provinces in, if I'm not mistaken, central and the southern provinces. And I think that's a very good way in which like, even though that like we're not close to, you know, like the place physically, we're still able to, you know, give some sort of like support so that we can move the students to places where they can continue and finish their studies. And I think that's a very good example of the Jesuit community and like the whole cohort of Jesuit schools around the world, and in particular in Latin America, that they, you know, try to, even like when there's problems, conflicts arise, like there's this sort of unity that brings us together to like find solutions that can work for all.
Thank you. And we've mentioned that, referred to this campaign several times tonight. Several people have the Todos Somos UCA campaign, and a link to that is on our resources page for this dialogue, and I hope people have a chance to follow up on that. Now thank you. Let's take questions from our audience. We have folks on either side who are going to be walking around with microphones. Please raise your hand high, identify who you are and what your question is, and we'll go from there. Anna?
Yes, Erasmo Gonzalez. I am a Joya, 1972, business school. I'd like to say a couple of things. Part of what Father Carnes, quite accurately mentioned about how Ortega was tightening little by little since 2018. In that, during those protests, there were about 300 people that were shot. Not only put in jail, another, important number. That's very important. In the tightening, I have also observed that it has a relationship directly in the way Mr. Putin is operating, in the sense of trying to gain more control of the country through Ortega. So I wanted to bring, the problems we are, let's say, analyzing, studying, and the solidarity calls, which are obvious, has to do with a bigger context. And that has been going on, as the father mentioned also, for many years.
Thank you.
Thanks
very much. And I wonder, Matt, if you might react a little bit to, of course, we have to recognize the just horrific violence that's going on. And this idea of authoritarianism and how it is growing there, and maybe it's where we see parallels in other places as well.
Well, one of the most interesting trends globally right now that you see in Latin America in a particular way, and with this regime in a particular way, for those of us who are a bit older, back in the 1960s, 70s, the most common way for a democracy to die was the military stepping in and either killing or exiling the president at the time. And then we had these really brutal authoritarian regimes throughout a long period in Latin America. More recently, the ways that democracies die, and here I'm working a little bit from the work of Steve Litsky and Daniel Ziblatt, and Steve Litsky was here actually speaking earlier today in dialogue with Jim Wallace, so it's nice to cite him at this moment. But what's changed is that now democracies are dying because elected democratic leaders are dismantling them from the inside. So Ortega, when he comes back, is legitimately elected. So it's not that he comes to power without a legitimate election. But then once he's in power, he starts changing the institution so that he can stay in power, eliminating others from being able to run for office, limiting free speech, limiting space, as we've said so often, but also then changing the rules of the game. So changing who can stand for election, changing the way the votes are counted, changing the electoral cycle and schedule. All of these are ways of dismantling democracy from the inside. And what he has done is actually something we see in a number of countries around the globe today. Congressman McGovern mentioned Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who's doing something similar right now. So the El Salvadoran Constitution does not make provision for a re-election of a president. This is not something that's supposed to happen. But he said that he will stand for re-election, hold election, in which he himself will run and expects to win. So this is something where this dismantling of democracy from the inside is extremely, extremely dangerous for us today. And now it often can, when it can, exist with minimal repression. But then there are these moments when it has horrible repression, as you mentioned, the 300 protesters killed back in 2018. And this is something that an authoritarian regime can always wield as its final show of force, is that ability to coerce with lethal violence. And that's something which often rises to the top in terms of our awareness, but actually is emblematic of that slow turning of the screws that the regime is managing to try to extricate as much power as it can for itself and accrue as much power as it can for itself and deny the rights of others.
Thanks, Matt. Rena, do you have something to add?
And if I can add something to that, the other thing is delegitimizing certain institutions, like, the UCAS. The same thing in El Salvador. The one thing is to attack the UCA over there and to attack these institutions that go against them. So again, it's exactly what you said, to dismantle it from the inside. And everybody else starts believing, well, maybe he's right, because again, you've decimated the education system, you've decimated all of these spaces in the way that things worked before, so that you're sort of, the electorate is kind of lost. But again, it's that hitting at these institutions that had some way to go toward a full democracy.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. Who has a microphone? Sorry. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Harrison Hanvey. I work at the Jesuit Conference here in DC. I also lived in Nicaragua from 2015 to 2017. First of all, thank you so much for bringing this conversation about, very important. My question is, especially for Representative McGovern, as someone who lived the response after the Jesuits and their companions were killed in El Salvador in '89, and Father Matthew, as a Jesuit priest and a professor here at Georgetown. You know, we're in one of the most powerful, wealthiest universities, Jesuit universities, and universities in general in the United States. We've been talking about the Todos Somos UCA campaign. I interviewed a couple UCA students recently who were in their final year when the university was closed. And what they talked about was to be so close to graduating and then have that all taken away. So I'm just wondering what advice you would have for the Jesuit communities here at Georgetown and across the United States. How can we organize ourselves to help these students fulfill their dreams, whether that be at the Rafael Landivar or at the UCA San Salvador? Thank you.
Well, you know, look, I mean, raise the money and help them finish their education at a Jesuit university somewhere else. Or let's find ways, to get Congress to authorize funds that could be used to help people who were forced to end their education sooner. I don't, it's probably easier for you to raise the money than to get Congress to do anything. But I want to say one thing, and the reason why I really said without hesitation yes to any invitation here at Georgetown, when the Jesuits were killed in El Salvador, the movement, the movement to change our policy, the movement to demand justice, yeah, there were members in Congress that were raising their voices, but the pressure came from the Jesuit colleges and universities in this country. When the presidents of all these colleges came to Capitol Hill, they did multiple delegations to El Salvador. I mean, they represent not just the name, but this incredible alumni that all of a sudden became activated. I remember we had dinners here at Georgetown. I don't even know what the room is. It's like a big library or whatever. Yeah, we had these really dinners with members of Congress, members of the United States Senate, some of them who were on the line about not knowing whether they wanted to be critical of El Salvador, even after the murders of the priests, where the president of Georgetown was then Leo O'Donovan, and then some prominent Georgetown alum would be there, and then we would move them to yes. And so but it was the power of these universities and their alumni that changed U.S. policy toward El Salvador. I mean, we had an archbishop killed, we had nuns murdered and raped, you had tens of thousands of innocent civilians killed, and yet Congress continued just to, and administrations, continued to just maintain the status quo of sending military aid, nothing ever changed. It changed then. So there's power here. There's power at this university and at other Jesuit universities to get the focus back on what's happening in Nicaragua, to actually, as a concrete, assignment, to help those students and those faculty who were displaced, to get them to another Jesuit college or university so they can finish their studies or can continue to teach. Because to me, that is, and the message to Ortega is one that, there's perseverance here. He didn't win. Yeah, he may have forced people to go to a different college or university. They're still going to get a Jesuit education, and they're going to be more equipped than ever to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights, as they grow older, and that may be their mission. So, but understand the debate, the policy, Congress's actions on El Salvador after the Jesuits were murdered happened because of the pressure that came out of Jesuit colleges and universities all throughout this country. And I always get, people always say to me, well, you say that because you went to a Jesuit college, a university. I said, no, I get rejected at all the Jesuit colleges and universities I applied to. I felt I got an education with all the time I spent with the Jesuits in El Salvador, but I'm just telling you, what changed things was the involvement of the universities.
That's important to know and important to remember for us here. I wonder if we're running up against our time, and so I just want to go around our group one more time and say, if you had one takeaway for our audience here, one thing for people to remember as they leave tonight, what would you go ahead and tell us? Rena, let's start with you. And we'll do this before we have a hymn after this, and so I want to be sure that we get to that as well. Go ahead, Rena.
I mean, I think we all have different kinds of circles in different kind of interests, and some of us can advocate, I think on the streets or with your, representatives. And then others, one beautiful thing that I have seen here at Holy Trinity, Georgetown, is the way that they have reached out to Nicaraguans, especially the ones who ended up over here, not just material help, but the beautiful friendship that they have accompanied them with. So everybody else knows, what their circle is, what their interests are, and see where you might be able to fit your interests into this situation.
Thank you. How about you, Matt?
As we finish, and maybe picking up on something that Congressman McGovern said, it strikes me that we should never underestimate how important our dollars are. So we can actually think about where we can give aid in the world, both as a country and as individuals. Now, our dollars are limited, most all of us, and there are enough causes that sometimes we only can do so much. But that's not nothing. Second, we should never forget how important our voice is, and to keep raising our voice and keep speaking, especially when others can't raise their voice. And really, the only reason I was willing to be on this panel tonight was because I know that other Nicaraguans could not, because it would be much better if we had Nicaraguan voices up here tonight who could speak this way. So our voices are so important. But then finally, I think actually we should never underestimate how important our vision is. And it's very telling, we're doing this as a Dahlgren dialogue, right? We're doing this here in this church. We're doing this as a religious community. As I mentioned earlier, we have a transcendent vision. We believe, we're playing, to use Congressman McGovern's line, the liberation game. This is the long game, right? This is the kind of thing where we really believe that we can do sustained effort day after day and year after year. We can hit those moments when things really do change. This is not something we were frozen in forever. And so that vision strikes me, it's more important than our voice and our dollars. It's actually the thing that nobody can take away from us, and that desperately people in Nicaragua want to know that we have with them. Our prayers, our solidarity, and our sense of vision of who we can be.
And I hope people in Nicaragua know that from this conversation here tonight for sure. Renato, how about yourself? If you had one thing to convey, one thing for people to take away, what would you say from our conversation tonight?
I think that education and freedom of speech go hand in hand. And I think as students, particularly at Georgetown, we have a value to our society outside of the school. And we should bring up, lift up those voices for everyone that is not able to speak publicly because of another oppression or fear of retaliation from their own people and their government.
Thank you. And thank you for doing that for us here tonight. Representative McGovern, how about yourself?
I would just say that, we all have to become activists on this issue. Activism works. We have to leave here with an assignment, and whether it's we're going to help raise some money, or whether we're going to talk to our member of Congress, or whether we're going to do something to show solidarity with the Jesuits who are, under great duress in Nicaragua, but also to support the Jesuit communities in Latin America that are trying to make sure that a Jesuit education exists for young people in Nicaragua and all throughout Latin America. But we got to do something. I go to lots of meetings, and you go to lots of meetings where we all, it's like therapy sessions. We all kind of reassure each other that we all think the same, right? And then we leave, and we say, that was a great meeting, and then we get on with our life. I think the issue here is how do we not do that, and how do we do something? Look, this issue ought to be talked about a lot more in Congress. We need to be doing more briefings in Congress. We need to be educating more members of Congress about what's going on. And we need to give them good advice about what to do. We don't want more demagogues, right? We want people who are going to actually do things that will help people. So, as I said before, you get incredible power. We ought to use it. And I remember one thing that Father Eya Correa, who was one of the priests who was killed in El Salvador in 1989, he was the rector of the university at the time he was killed. But he always viewed the university as a kind of almost a political institution, that this is a place to compel political activism, not in a partisan way, but in action. You know, that the obligation of the university, as he saw it in El Salvador, was to be a voice for the poor, to be an advocate for the poor. It wasn't just about let's learn for the sake of learning. It was about learning to use that knowledge and that power to do something. And that would be my request. Again, I think there's lots of power and influence in this room and at this university alone, and that we could actually make a real difference in what's happening in Nicaragua and, quite frankly, what might be happening in other countries in Latin America.
And that's at the heart of what we're doing here, right? A faith that does justice. And I think that it's so important that we're having this conversation in this sacred space. We'll end our conversation in just a moment with a hymn from our friends, led by our friends in the Office of Mission and Ministry. But before we do that, I want all of you please to join me in thanking Rena Guidos, Father Matt Carnes, Renata Yantop-Pelosi, and Representative Jim McGovern. Just a couple more things. Just a quick heads up that we will have one more dialogue this semester on war and peace, and please look for more details on that from our website in the coming days. I'd also like to tell you that a recording of this discussion will be posted on our website, and you can see follow-up resources there as well, including those about the Todos Somos UCA campaign that we've talked about several times tonight. I want to highlight the significant work being done by so many other Jesuit universities and by the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities here. And again, we've heard a lot about that here tonight. And I want to thank especially our colleagues in the Office of Mission and Ministry, Father Mark Bosco, John Crowley-Buck, Russ Weissman for helping us bring this wonderful conversation together. Thanks as always to John and Kimberly and Anna and Christian for their help in organizing this gathering, and to all of you for joining us here, both at Georgetown and online, those of you watching online. Now please join us in singing a hymn led by our colleagues in the Office of Mission and Ministry, God of Day and God of Darkness, which is available in your programs. Thank you.
God of day and God of darkness, now we stand before the night. As the shadows stretch and deepen, come and make our darkness bright. For creation still is groaning for the dawning of your might. When the sun of peace and justice fills the earth with radiant light. Still the nations curse the darkness, still the rich oppress the poor. Still the earth is bruised and broken by the ones who still want more. Come and wake us from our sleeping, so our hearts cannot ignore. All your people lost and broken, all your children at our door. You shall be the path that guides us, you the light that in us burns, shining deep within all people, yours the love that we must learn. For our hearts shall wander restless till they safe to you return, finding you in one another, we shall all your face discern. Praise to you in day and darkness, you are source and you are end. Praise to you who love and nurture as a father, mother, friend. Grant us all a peaceful resting, let each mind and body mend. So we rise refreshed tomorrow, hearts renewed to kingdom tend.